King Solomon had to be crazy. 300 wives. That's 300 anniversaries to keep track of, 600 in-laws, and being told to pick up your underwear off the floor 900 times every day. I've never met anyone who thought that 300 wives sounded like a good idea. Doesn't seem very wise. If any of us wanted advice for anything, we probably aren't asking the guy who got married 300 times. And yet, we do. Because this is the guy who wrote the quintessential book of the Bible on wisdom, Proverbs. And then he also wrote the sexual manual, Song of Solomon. That one isn't so surprising. And then later he wrote the most depressing book of the Bible, Ecclesiastes. But that's a lot more understandable when you remember the guy had 300 wives. If you go to the New Testament, one of the qualifications for a pastor is that he must be the husband of but one wife. Fair enough. Yet turn back to the Old Testament and it's full of godly men who would have failed this test for spiritual leadership. And it wasn't just Solomon, Abraham, Jacob, Esau, Gideon, even David. David, who wrote most of the Psalms. David, who was called a man after God's own heart. David, who was the king not of Utah, but of God's nation of Israel. Why did so many ancient figures, even what we would call biblical heroes, have multiple wives? And more importantly to us, why does it seem like God was okay with it? I find this to be weird, and I'd like to explore why it's in the Bible. Turn to Genesis 2, and let's get weird. Welcome to Weird Stuff in the Bible, where we explore scripture passages that are bizarre, perplexing, or just plain weird. This is Luke Taylor, and today we're going to be talking about polygamy. And by the way, this is the third in a series of episodes that I'm doing on strange things in the Old Testament law, but I have something special planned for next week. It's an interview with Beatty Carmichael, author of the book, The Prayer of Freedom. Beatty is an experienced deliverance minister. He's helped more than 1,000 people get rid of demonic influences in their life personally. And who knows how many people he's helped with his book and his online teachings. So I hope that you will join in next week to hear that interview. And then we're going to be exploring some new subjects after that. But it's actually the 2-year anniversary of this podcast. And so I wanted to celebrate it by bringing on an interview guest. And we found someone here who has a lot to say on some of the subjects that we've been studying this year. And so that'll be next week. So now on to today's teaching. Let's talk about polygamy. God establishes this institution of marriage in the opening chapters of the Bible. Marriage, it is the fundamental building block of all society. And it's been that way since the creation of the world. Genesis 2:21 through 25, it says, "So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and brought her to the man. Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because woe is man.'" No, just kidding there. "She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and were not ashamed." So we see marriage established very clearly here as between one man and one woman. And yet, very early on in the Bible, you start to see people break that pattern. In Genesis 4, right after the story of Cain and Abel, Cain gets banished for killing Abel. He eventually has a descendant named Lamech. Genesis 4:19 says, "And Lamech took 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah." And by the way, Lamech was far from the last person to try this. As we said in the opening, there are numerous biblical characters who have multiple wives at the same time, and some of them are what we might call heroes or great men of the Bible. And the Bible doesn't really directly comment on the fact that many of these men seem to break with what God had set up as the marital norm. So, was it a sin for them? And would it be a sin today? I want to give you 4 arguments today for why polygamy is wrong and was always wrong, even though some of our biblical heroes engaged in it. So for the first one, let's talk about how we read the Bible and how we pull lessons from the Bible. Robert Alter wrote a book called The Art of Biblical Narrative. This man is a Jewish scholar. He says that part of the purpose of biblical narrative is that it teaches us how the world works and how the world doesn't work. So if somebody keeps trying something and it doesn't work out, the Bible is recording this for us to teach us that it's a bad idea. And he says when it comes to polygamy, you can tell it's a bad idea because everybody who tries it is having an absolutely horrible time with it. Socially, culturally, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and relationally. Guys, it's true. Without fail, every single one of these so-called heroes of the Bible who has multiple wives, they end up getting severe family problems because of it. It either leads to problems between the wives or to disaster between the children. Abraham, David, Gideon, we're going to see later, especially Solomon, these guys screw up their families and their personal lives. So Robert Alter says, if you read the Bible and you think that it's teaching you that polygamy is a great idea, then you don't even know how to read, because it is obvious that polygamy is a bad idea. Look at Elkanah. He married 2 women in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Their names were Hannah and Peninnah. And if you're going to marry 2 women, it's already bad enough to do that. Why would you marry 2 women whose names basically rhyme? That's just dumb. But he did it, and he's kind of a dumb guy if you read the whole chapter. 1 Samuel 1, verses 4 through 6. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So we see that Peninnah is miserable because she's not as loved as the other wife, and Hannah is miserable because she can't have kids like the other wife, and Elkanah is miserable because he can't keep either one of them happy, and Elkanah's kind of a thick-headed guy, and he doesn't really learn the lesson here, but I hope that we do. Polygamy is demonstrably a bad idea. Another example, we read Jacob and all his wives getting them pregnant in Genesis 29 and 30, and we read about how they kind of wheel and deal for his attention. There's this line, and Rachel says to Leah, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." And I'm reading that, and I'm like, that's just creepy. I don't even know what mandrakes are, to be honest, but it just sounds creepy that the women are trading mandrakes for time with the husband. And then, of course, Jacob's wives keep getting jealous, and they start competing to see who can have the most kids, and they bring in their servants for Jacob to sleep with so they can keep trying to rack up the score. It's all just gross, okay? And so one of the ways that we should read the biblical narratives is that we do want to try to find the moral of the story. And oftentimes, the moral is pretty obvious, all right? God's not usually trying to hide this from us. I've been reading the story of Gideon with my son the past few weeks. And as you read Gideon's story, it's quite obvious that he's a very fearful man. When you first meet him, he's threshing wheat in a wine press. Next, he doesn't want to tear down the idols that are in his hometown. So he goes and he does it in the middle of the night. He tries to get out of his mission twice with the whole fleece thing that he does with God, with the dew. And then God takes his army of 32,000 soldiers and whittles it down to 300 men. And then, of course, Gideon runs off the Midianites with 300 men. The moral of the story is never stated. An angel never says something like, "See, Gideon, if you won't give in to fear and if you will lean on the Lord in your weakness, he can strengthen you and use you to accomplish mighty things." Nobody pops their head in to say that, but it's obvious that that's what the lesson is when you read the story. You don't even need it spelled out to you. And polygamy could kind of be looked at the same way. The Bible shows us through narrative again and again and again that polygamy is just a plain bad idea. All right, even if it doesn't spell it out specifically like we might want it to, but that is reason number 1 that polygamy is wrong. Reason number 2, it contradicts God's original design for marriage. And we read those verses in Genesis 2 earlier. Now, maybe you hear that and you say, well, Luke, times change. Just because God did something a certain way in Genesis, does that mean that's how we should always do it? Well, Jesus was confronted with a question like this in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 6. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? and said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Now, if all that sounds familiar, it's because, we just quoted it back at the start of the episode. Jesus was asked here whether it's okay to get divorced. Jesus' reply was that marriage was meant to be one man and one woman for life, going all the way back to Genesis 2. Now, by this point in the Bible, it had been approximately 4,000 years since Adam and Eve were created. It's only been another 2,000 years for us since this question came around. So, back to our question from a moment ago. Just because God did something a certain way in Genesis, does that mean that's how we should always do it? Well, in Jesus' day, the answer was yes. So maybe you're thinking, okay, but that was a question about divorce. That wasn't about polygamy. And man, I wish Jesus had been asked a question on polygamy. I would have loved to hear what he had to say. But even though that's not what was asked of him, he was asked about divorce. Here's something that we can probably extrapolate, though, from his answer. Polygamy was not a part of God's original design for marriage in Genesis 2. He said, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." He didn't say hold fast to his wives. He didn't say the two, and then two more, and then two more, that they're going to be one flesh. God's original design for marriage was one man and one woman. And then the New Testament also brings in the fact that part of the purpose for marriage is to teach us about Christ and the church. Let me read Ephesians 5:22 through 24. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." I know this is off to a great start. Verse 23, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior." Verse 24, "Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." I'm going to jump down to verse 31. "Therefore," Paul's quoting this again that we've read twice already, "a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." So, if you are a Christian, then you are part of this worldwide body of Christ that is known as the church, and this means that you are married to Jesus. Just as Jesus loves us, husbands are to love their wives. Like if you've ever witnessed a husband who is just a spectacular man to his wife, like a very admirable, a very devoted husband, well, that gives you a picture here on earth of how Jesus is devoted and caring toward us. And that's part of the purpose of marriage. And by the way, my friend Daniel Moore, he just released a book on marriage. It's called Marriage as a Mission, Living Out God's Design for Marriage. I would highly recommend this book, even though I'm only about halfway through it right now. But it just keeps getting better and better as I go. It contains a lot of both theology, but also practical application of that theology about marriage. And it says this in chapter 5. "Just as Christ leads with love and the church responds with trust and devotion, husbands and wives reflect that divine relationship through their unity and distinct roles. When marriage works the way God intended, it's not only a blessing to the couple, it's a powerful display of God's truth and grace to a watching world." So again, that's from Marriage as a Mission. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and probably lots of other places too. So the church, again, this is us. It's all Christians everywhere, no matter what denomination you are. Like even if you don't know what a denomination is, okay, you could be like the thief on the cross and you don't even know the first thing about theology. But as long as you're saved, you are a part of the capital C church, and this is the bride of Christ. And marriage teaches us how Christ relates to us, his bride. Jesus did not have multiple wives, and there are not multiple ways to Christ. There is only one way, and so this picture right here, this is the second reason that polygamy is wrong, because it contradicts God's original design for marriage and his stated purpose for what marriage is. A third reason that I would say polygamy is wrong is based on some specific commands that are given in each of the Testaments. So for kings specifically, we see this command in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 18:17. and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. So one of the laws for Israel's kings was not to multiply his wives, and it even gives a specific reason for that. It said he would turn away his heart from God if he were to do that. Too many wives would cause a king to forget about God. That's basically what it's saying. It also gives an admonition in that section for the king not to collect too many horses, because then he would just trust in his own military might, and not to make himself too rich, presumably because he would trust then in his money over God. And so we see a case study in all of that stuff from Deuteronomy 18. We see it in the life of King Solomon himself. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 and 2. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. So guys, it was in love. Does that make it okay? God is love, right? Shouldn't God be okay with more love? Love is love. Isn't that what people say nowadays as they trample on God's commands about marriage? No. Love is not a legitimate reason to reject God's standards. You cannot sin and say it's okay if you're doing it in the name of love. So here's what happened to Solomon. Verse 3, he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Man, I said that wrong at the beginning of the episodes. It wasn't 300 wives, it was 700 wives, and it was 300 concubines. And so sorry I got that wrong, but anyway, it's obviously it's way too many women. It's worse than what I had said. And if you keep reading that chapter, Solomon's life ends in a very poor way. He ends it very, very far from God. And some question whether Solomon even made it to heaven, or if he apostatized, if he fell away from God. And personally, I don't know the answer. But I do appreciate that he wrote Song of Solomon first. So we see this prohibition in Deuteronomy against kings multiplying their wives in the Old Testament, and a very clear lesson that's provided in Solomon's life. Again, narrative teaches us that polygamy is a bad idea. We also see a ban on polygamy in the New Testament church in the restrictions on who can be a pastor or an elder or a deacon in the church. 1 Timothy chapter 3, it says, "Therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife." So the very first guideline there is that he's the husband of one wife. It's the second guideline mentioned in Titus 1:6. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife. These are the pastoral epistles that give the rules for who can be a pastor. Now, you've probably heard these verses pointed out before to say that people who are divorced cannot be pastors. And I understand that interpretation of this passage. I'm not even saying it's wrong. I'm not saying your church or denomination needs to change its rules. I think my own denomination says this. But honestly, I don't think this was about divorce. I think it sounds like it's about polygamy. And regardless of where you stand on the divorce thing, I'm sure we would all agree, being a polygamist, it would disqualify you from leadership in the New Testament church. And how interesting it is, and how weird it is, that we have books of the Bible written by people who would be disqualified from leadership in our own churches today. But regardless, reason number 3 that I'd say polygamy is wrong is that we have commands forbidding it for kings and for pastors. And reason number 4 today, polygamy is wrong because we have a command against it for everybody else. Let me start by bringing up a letter that we received from a listener named Isaiah a while back. And I hope you're still listening, Isaiah. I'm finally replying. I replied in an email, but I'm finally replying here. He wrote in with this question. Who was the Cushite woman that Moses married? Numbers 12:1. It says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So Isaiah asks where this Cushite woman came from, since we really only know about Moses' wife, Zipporah. And for the record, Zipporah was a Midianite woman. A Cushite would have been a descendant of Ham, and so it would have been an African woman with dark skin. Miriam and Aaron apparently had a problem with that in Numbers 12, probably racially motivated. And so the question is, did Moses have 2 wives? Was he a polygamist? just like many of the other biblical heroes. So I want to provide three possibilities. One, it's possible that Zipporah was the Cushite woman. Midianites were probably darker-skinned people. They lived nearer to the darker-skinned people in Africa. Perhaps Miriam and Aaron had a problem with Zipporah herself, and the Bible is only referring to her here as Cushite because she had enough African ancestry mixed in with her bloodline that she had darker skin. So that is one possibility. And this is actually where I lean because I think it's more likely than the other two options. Second option is that Moses' first wife died, and so he's on his second marriage now. That would not be polygamy because it wouldn't be having two wives simultaneously. We have no idea when Zipporah died or whatever happened to her. So if she wasn't the Cushite, it's entirely possible that the Cushite wife came along after Zipporah. The reason I don't subscribe to that view myself is that Moses often admonished the Israelites not to take foreign wives because they generally worshipped foreign gods. And we saw that with the story of Solomon earlier. God doesn't have a problem with interracial marriage, but God doesn't endorse unequally yoked marriages where one person believes in God and the other one doesn't. So I'm sure Moses would not have married the Cushite if she was not a believer as well, but it would have set a really bad example if Israel's leader married a foreign woman while he was constantly telling the Israelites not to marry foreign women. So it just doesn't really seem likely to me that the Cushite came along later. To me, it makes more sense to say Zipporah, and she was said to be daughter of the Midianite Jethro, but it makes more sense to me to say that maybe Zipporah just had some Cushite blood, perhaps on her mom's side. And then a third possibility to explain this is that Moses had multiple wives and that he took a second wife during the wilderness wanderings. That is possible. I don't think it's likely, though, A, because of what I just said above about how it would not set a good example, and B, because of what Moses wrote in Leviticus 18:18. It says there, "And you shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive." So it sounds like a rule against taking sisters as wives, right? And so maybe you're thinking, what does that have to do with polygamy in general? Well, there is a really interesting note I found in Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. And I'll read here what it says on page 113. The wording of 18:18, literally, a woman to her sister, itself indicates that this is not a literal sister. The phrase a woman to her sister and its counterpart, a man to his brother, are used 20 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and never do they refer to a literal brother and sister. Rather, they are idioms for one in addition to another. So this verse doesn't refer to incest, rather, it refers to the addition of another wife to the first. So there you have it, guys. The phrase a woman to her sister, it doesn't refer to literal siblings under this understanding. It means another woman. Under that understanding, Leviticus 18:18 is the clearest condemnation of polygamy in the entire Bible. And if Moses himself wrote that, then I would find it hard to believe that he took a second wife simultaneously with the first. I could be wrong. Moses wasn't perfect. It wouldn't necessarily mess up any of our theology if he did do that, but I just doubt that he did. But as we've stated, there were plenty of other Old Testament figureheads who did take multiple wives, and that bothers me. And if I'm being honest, it bothers me that God never directly called them out on it. The only positive thing we might say about polygamy is that in that culture, women had a lot fewer options than men when it came to supporting themselves, especially if their husband died. Because if your husband died, you were no longer a virgin. And, like it or not, that made you less valuable to the men in that society. As far as being marriage material, it reduced your chances of getting another husband. And the women usually outnumbered the men because men would get killed in war and conflict, and men do riskier behavior. So more often women, it was them who found themselves single and alone, and their choices might have looked like either getting another man or starving to death, or, going into prostitution or some other kind of difficult lifestyle. And so there were generally more women in need of a spouse than there were men, and women were more significantly at risk if they couldn't get one. Now, I am not saying that excuses all cases of polygamy, but perhaps it makes it more understandable just from a logical point of view, and perhaps, therefore, why God didn't get so upset about it. We see an example of this when David takes his second wife, the wise Abigail, in 1 Samuel 25. Because of David's interference in her life in that chapter, her very stupid husband ends up dead. It says in 1 Samuel 25:39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. So Abigail is kind of the hero of that story. And David, if he just kind of rode off and left her in the dust after her husband died, things would have looked pretty bleak for her. And we'd be saying, poor Abigail, like she does everything right in this story, but she would have been better off if David had never even stopped by. But since he takes her as his wife, and I'm not saying it was all sunshine and roses being one of David's multiple wives, but at least she didn't die in destitution. So again, I'm not saying that excuses polygamy, but perhaps it's why God seemed to tolerate it. Now, there is nowhere in Scripture where you find an endorsement of polygamy. There are only negative things said about polygamy in the Bible, and there are only negative depictions of polygamy. Like they might make propaganda on Netflix with shows like Sister Wives, and they try to make it look like a happy, functional atmosphere. But there are no polygamous families in Scripture where everyone is getting along and the kids are doing great. It typically ends with the wives at each other's throats and the kids trying to kill each other. So there you have it, 4 reasons that polygamy is wrong. It has always been wrong and will always be wrong. We'll leave it there for today, guys. Hey, thank you for being with me the past 2 years on this podcast. Again, I have a special treat for next week. There's an interview with Beatty Carmichael. He is the author of the book, The Prayer of Freedom. He's an expert in the area of spiritual legal rights, which a lot of you have been interested in learning more about. And he's really good at just talking us through how to prevent demons and spiritual attacks from disrupting your life. He has some amazing stories of God's supernatural provision. So I hope you will come back next week. And shout out to Caleb also, who wrote in this week. He said he found the podcast just a few weeks ago, and he's already listened to over half the episodes. Caleb, he's out in Ireland, actually. Just blows my mind, to hear that someone's listened to that much so fast, but he's catching up. Hey, glad to have a new official weirdo on the team. And by the way, guys, we are nearing episode 100, and I'll have another special surprise for you lined up in that episode too. So, if you think that polygamy is weird, that's a good thing. I hope that we are all in agreement on that today. And thanks for listening. God bless you for sticking around till the end. And we'll see you next time on Weird Stuff in the Bible.